Epilogue. Welcome home. In the Ponyville sky, the sun smiled warmly downwards. Pegasi danced amongst small, rotund clouds. Earth ponies walked the paved stone streets, saddlebags straddling their backs. Unicorns were the rarest breed of all, and the few she'd seen kept a hasty pace as they went about their lives. Even from a casual glance, one thing was obvious. Ponyville was a town now, not a village. Houses extended towards Canterlot, blurring into multicoloured dots far in the distance. Town Hall's flag flew above a new, red stone building that was surrounded by glittering, moving shapes, and the old schoolhouse had been built with a fence surrounding the grounds. The massive tree in the middle of town had been abandoned, and the bronze plaque had been etched in front of the hanging doors. At her height, it was just a glinting speck in a painting. As the chariot descended, Twintail found herself hunching away from its thin metal sides. No doubt it was protected and enchanted to deflect spells or projectiles, but she wasn't sure that the protection extended to the passengers as well. Keeping a low profile was almost second nature to her. Common sense, too. Behind and below her, steam whistles shrieked as the train slid to a stop alongside a long stretch of wood. Soon, the train had unfolded its sides to begin the process of unloading all sorts of cargo and people. The station hadn't been that big the last time she'd seen it. Ponyville's wall stood to the east, a thin line of wood, metal and stone that the citizens hoped would protect them from the darkness in the forest on the other side. Even from up here in the chariot, she could see the anti-air defences in the nearby guard base. The base itself was a great piece of flattened, thinly grassed land sitting on what had once been the no-ponies land between the Everfree and the village itself. One side was bordered by the wall. The opposite side had a gate that opened into a wide dirt road which snaked towards the town itself. White buildings, gilded with yellow paint, jutted out of the ground like teeth. In between them rushed a plethora of armoured guards. From her height, they just looked like insects. One patrol of Pegasus guards banked towards them, then broke into salutes as soon as they saw the princess sitting next to her. Twintail kept her eyes on them until they were mere dots in the blue sky. There was a light touch on her back. Adrenaline smashed into her bloodstream. Her heart rate doubled instantly as Twintail twisted around, her lips drawn back to expose teeth and her horn at the ready. She found herself looking at the princess's unfurled snow-white wing. As she turned back, she thought she caught the princess's sigh, but the exhale was so quiet that it almost mixed into the rustle of feathers on a closing wing, or the wind rushing past the chariot. Perhaps it was just her imagination. They angled towards the base. Close by, she spotted a small cottage that sat beside a small, still brook. No light seeped through the drawn curtains, although there were the remnants of hundreds of animals' worth of burrows and nests surrounding the cottage. There was no sign of life. It was a miniature ghost town. Below them, a thin strip of hard-baked grass and dirt rose to meet them. As they descended, Twintail began to appreciate the true height of the wall separating the Everfree from civilization. It rose 10 metres into the air, a massive construct of what seemed to be solid stone with wood and enchanted steel weaving through like veins. Sapphire power gems were inset in regular intervals along its length, glowing bright blue as they powered the spells woven into the wall. A wooden system of steps that seemed to have grown out of the wall itself led to both the gem and to a small platform that punched out just below the top of the wall. Pegasi trotted along the top, patrolling the length of it. They were armed with binoculars, whilst a few unicorns on duty sat near the locked weapon racks. Her horn felt a hint of warmth as a nearby section of the wall discharged a spell. Her eyes couldn't catch the telltale blue flash, but she could hear the dying squeak of some small animal and smell the scent of carbonized flesh drifting in the soft wind. The princess stood up, and Twintail realised that they'd landed. "Follow me," Celestia said, and leapt off the chariot onto the grass. Twintail did so, and in the far distance she could just about resolve Canterlot's white gold spires. At this distance they were as substantial as hares. Tendrils of smoke from 1,000 chimney pipes linked together into a cloud of wispy, whitish smog that hung in the sky above Ponyville proper. Amongst the rolling hills of an apple plantation, she recognised the factory's single smokestack, standing tall and alone amongst the greenery. By her side, Celestia exhaled quite loudly, and Twintail returned her gaze to the princess, whose wings gestured towards 7 ponies in front of her. Her mind whirred as her eyes passed over their forms. She knew she'd seen them before, but for some reason their names eluded her right now, slipping away from her mental grasp like a skittish fish. Only Cadence's name sprung to the forefront of her mind in those few seconds. She frowned, stepping forwards a tiny half-step. One stood off to the side. This earth mare had her mane cascading down her neck like a pink waterfall. Her sky-blue eyes were creased around the edges with obvious pain and sorrow, but they glinted with a deeper, more solid emotion. Twintail's frown deepened, for just a moment, but she turned away to face another. The only stallion in the group raised his head. He was a big white unicorn with an oddly striped blue mane, who seemed to hang off his gilded purple armour instead of the other way around. Twintail saw the lines of grey running through his mane, his widening blue eyes, the way he seemed to drag himself forwards as if he was unwilling to approach her, and yet was forced to. His eyes laid over with bags, creased with wrinkles that extended to his temples, and from there tracked over his forehead. A dead pony walking. He didn't cry out, or scream, or burst into tears. He merely gaped at her, meeting her eye for eye. By his side, Princess Cadence smiled warmly, but passively, an onlooker, once the closest friends, now nothing more than an acquaintance in the back of Twintail's mind. It had been 20 years after all. He opened his mouth, and then closed it again, before Princess Cadence nudged him over with the elbow of her wing. Twintail turned to her side, where the saddlebag hung. With a tendril of magic and a short glance backwards, she took out 7 small steel tags. Most of them were blackened and deformed, physically barely recognisable, but she could sense the weak magic imprints humming on the metal. She tossed them in front of his feet, and the tags clattered for a moment before he picked them up with a hoof. "I'd sent 15, he muttered as he turned over one of the tags, over and over, blinking repeatedly as he did so. The group of mares had stood still while she'd interacted with her brother, but now one of them strode out. It was a light blue Pegasus with a rainbow mane. She had put on some weight since her last time in the newspapers, but she still had the powerful wing muscles, lean legs and taut frame that had made her famous. It was the newly retired captain of the Wonderbolt's Rainbow Dash, and the most controversial one to date. There had been many allegations that her placement had been influenced by the infamous disappearance of 2 of her dearest friends about 2 decades ago, and it looked like it had all taken a toll on her. Her face was haggard and lined with exhaustion and the remnants of recently departed stress. Her eyes, however, flickered with life that was flowing into her veins once more, confused and conflicted. Hope and anger raged in them like twin fires. Dash whistled, the sound reminiscent of the call of a solitary eagle. "What happened, Twilight?" Twintail winced, and she turned her head to face another. Distantly, she could hear Princess Celestia introduce her to them. Reintroduce, that is. Another one of the group, a white unicorn with an unreasonably impractical mane, made a little sound. Twintail's eyes shriveled to examine her. The white unicorn's hoof was over her mouth, her azure eyes wide and dilated in horror. Even her white fur seemed to have become paler as she stared at Twintail. Twintail looked down. As she moved, she could see the metallic tattoos shift with her skin. They glimmered under the bright sunlight, like silver snakes welded into her skin. She lifted her hoof, twisting it, and saw them gleam hungrily in the bright burning sun. Rarity. Yes, the name struck her out of the blue, like a long-buried memory. Twintail looked closer at her, noticing the bags beneath her eyes that had been covered skillfully by makeup, the grey roots of her mane, and the sheer shock in her face. In the ordered, utilitarian environment of the guard base, her flowing dress looked incongruous. A thin and delicate gold bracelet, carved in the likeness of a pair of serpentine dragons chasing one another, wound around her hoof. Around the collar of her too-tight dress, a sliver of a heart-shaped fire ruby glimmered like a fresh drop of blood. Twintail turned her gaze to the last 2 in the group, both of whom stood a little to the side behind Rarity. A yellow Pegasus with a short-cut pink mane and tail stood like she'd had her limbs broken with the way she was shaking. Her gaze kept drifting towards the abandoned cottage in the distance, and despite her gritted teeth and low mutterings, there were drops of tears forming in the corners of her teal eyes. It looked as though she'd been pulled straight out of work, judging by the white lab coat she wore. It was stained with splotches of translucent red and yellow-brown, and looked as worn and beaten as its wearer. When she noticed Twintail's gaze, she froze, eyes wide in complete and utter fear. As Twintail looked on, that instant, primal fear melted into something else. It was cold and empty, devoid of emotion, shock and then dread, and then icy nothingness. It was the sort of feeling that someone would get when they were just told that their friend had become a mass murderer. The other pony was an orange earth pony whose straw yellow mane was tied into a tight, no-nonsense bun. Her face was neutral, too neutral to be natural. Her jaw was set, teeth definitely not gritted, and her eyes burned with an odd cocktail of pain, anger, surprise, and, despite all of her attempts to crush it, hope and joy. The wrinkles in her sun-worn face only made her freckles stand out more. All of them had buried their pain deep inside of them. They dealt with it over the years, and learned to live with it. Twintail could see it in their eyes, and now she was back. In them, cold, creeping betrayal, fought with sudden foreign joy, encrusted with layers of sadness, worn down with every building wave of excitement. Naive embers of hope battled against cautious, encroaching cynicism, and it looked like hope was winning. Somehow, to Twintail, that hurt even more than if they'd simply shown pure, unbridled anger. Finally, the pink earth pony stepped forwards, and almost everyone turned their gazes towards her. Twintail saw the look in her eyes, and her face tightened for a moment before she realised what it was. Fatalism. Resignation blended with cynicism, with all other emotion boiled away to leave a hard core of simple acceptance. This one, Pinkie Pie, that's who she is, had somehow known all along. She'd known, and she hadn't stopped Twilight in the very beginning. Hot anger and cold betrayal began to bubble up in Twintail's heart, but when she looked at it, looked at herself and what she'd done, and what she would have done, she found that she couldn't blame Pinkie. What would she have done? Even if Pinkie did beg her to stay, why would they even think she was still alive? Hot anger bubbled away, replaced by mounting emptiness that hurt more in its starkness. "I don't think I've met you before," Pinkie Pie called out softly, with a painful smile on her lips. The lie was evident in her eyes, as she stopped at a safe 12 steps away. "But welcome to Equestria. Welcome home, whoever you are." Welcome home indeed. The end.